Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 10 in the ongoing series, and in this episode we're going to look at JonBenet Ramsey's oldest brother, John Andrew Ramsey, who was 23 years old at the time of the incident. Now, let me just clear the air. John Andrew Ramsey was cleared very early by the investigation. I think this happened as early as December the 30th. So within 3, 4, 5 days, 4 days of the incident, it was sort of announced that all the adult children were out of the state at the time of the incident. The other thing is, John Andrew was actually in Boulder until today, until the 19th of December, 24 years ago. So he was a student studying at Colorado University, and then he left Boulder on the 19th, which is the day before a big Access Graphics party, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So he left, and then obviously he was back on the 26th of December, the day after Christmas. He was expecting to see his family, I think in Minneapolis, if I'm not mistaken, but basically elsewhere. And then obviously the incident happened, and instead him and his sister flew into Boulder the next day and arrived. I'm not quite sure what time it was, whether it was might have been somewhere around 2 p.m. or so. I think they arrived around about the same time that that JonBenet's body was discovered. Anyway, in this episode we're going to just deal in a little bit of detail with John Andrew and events surrounding him, and in particular looking at how John Andrew became a suspect and why that was kind of odd, especially after this media release on December the 30th. It was released by Leslie Ahome, and it was just made very clear that all the children were out of the state at the time. So anyway, before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So it's important to bear this context in mind, that the adult children were cleared very quickly. The stepchildren, Melinda Ramsey and John Andrew Ramsey. And this is what makes this next part really weird. And I suppose I've got to tell you a little bit about Fleet White, that you sort of understand what's going on here. And this information that I'm giving you now comes from Westword. It was published on the 17th of December 2014, so around about 6 years ago. And it kind of has to do with the Whites. So let me just give you a bit of background. Fleet White and John became sailing buddies. JonBenet and Fleet's daughter Daphne, they attended the same pre-kindergarten program, so that sort of set up a way that the Whites and the Ramseys kind of had things in common. John also invited them to Access Graphics parties, and Priscilla White was actually very much involved in planning Patsy's 40th birthday party in the fall of 1996, closer to I think it was the last day of November, that she planned Patsy's 40th birthday party. Now, Patsy's actual birthday party was, I think, right at the end of December the 29th to be exact. Now, obviously, because they were going to be away on vacationing with their children, they Patsy had a big party ahead of all the other parties when everyone was still kind of around. The Ramseys also celebrated Christmas at the Whites' home 2 years in a row, so 1995 and 1996. And the Whites visited the Ramseys at their vacation home in Michigan 2 summers in a row as well. And the Ramseys would later describe the Whites as their closest friends from Colorado. And this would change. In time, the Whites and the Ramseys would kind of be at one another's throats. The Whites would become the Ramseys' biggest critics. Fleet wanted John to be more public about the crime, talking to the media about it. I don't think he meant for him to go on CNN, though. I think he kind of meant, talk to the local media, talk to the police, and certainly not talk to the media, not talk to the police. And interestingly, an interest that they didn't share was child beauty pageants. And so Priscilla White found that she had to sort of, keep quiet about what she really thought about pageants when she was around Patsy, because Patsy was a former Miss West Virginia. In the article in Westward, it refers to the tension, the real tension in the relationship between the Whites and the Ramseys developed in the aftermath of JonBenet's death, and that Patsy kind of quickly went into a Valium fog. Patsy was sort of out of it very early on. Maybe she felt shock, and maybe she felt guilty, maybe she felt just terrible. And then talks about a legal team assembling, and this is the part that I want to emphasize. So bear in mind, all of this is happening in the few days following JonBenet's death, right? And so this is quoting from Westward. Over the next couple of days, as the JonBenet case began to make headlines, Fleet heard wild speculations on talk radio about John Ramsey's son from a previous marriage. So what Fleet heard was that someone on a talk radio station was talking about John Andrew possibly being involved. And of course he had an alibi. It wasn't even in the state. And this is something that repeated again with John Mark Carr, someone else who was implicated or associated with the crime, and he wasn't even, I'm not sure if he wasn't in the state, but I doubt whether he was even in town when this happened. So it's kind of a similar thing repeating itself. But anyway, in this case, Fleet hears these wild speculations about John Andrew, and he's not very happy about it, because Fleet knows John Andrew wasn't there. I mean, he knows because the Ramseys were at his home that Christmas. And obviously, had John Andrew been around, he probably would have seen him or known that he was, somewhere in town, kind of thing. And so Fleet White actually called the police, demanding a press release saying that what the cops and insiders knew to be true. And so that's the other thing. The cops knew that John Andrew wasn't a suspect. Other insiders knew that John Andrew wasn't a suspect, including the Ramseys themselves. So why are these wild speculations allowed to take place on the radio? And this is the part that is quite shocking. In response to calling the police, about this sort of fake news on the radio, he got an angry call from one of John's attorneys. So Brian Morgan calls him, telling him not to interfere. Now you've got to ask yourself, what the hell is going on there? Where, I mean, isn't Fleet totally justified, and isn't he actually trying to help John Andrew? Isn't he trying to help the Ramseys? And the only thing you can kind of think of is, well, what in terms of why on earth would the attorney call him and say don't interfere when what he was doing was justified? He was protecting a young man's reputation, and the young man was innocent. And So the fact that Brian Morgan didn't want him to interfere, I mean, what makes sense out of that situation? And the one thing that's possible is that someone felt that this rumor, that this gossip, that this false line of inquiry was needed, that people needed to be distracted, people needed to go down this this alley, this blind alley. People needed to do that so that attention was taken off somebody else. Does that make sense? I'm just offering a theory there. And then there was a big argument between Fleet and John at the sort of just before the funeral service, where John had kind of said, "I'm not coming back to Boulder. I'm going to stay in I'm going to stay in Atlanta, etc." And Fleet wasn't very happy with this. He felt that John must return to Boulder and help the police solve the crime, and get it over and done with, sort it out. And if you think about it, Fleet was kind of justified, because Fleet didn't want this thing to become this big cloud hanging over Boulder, this big cloud hanging over him. He wanted it to be sorted out so that the cloud would dissipate and the sun would shine again. And think about where we are now, 24 years later, has that cloud dissipated? So I don't know if this particular episode isn't more about Fleet White than John Andrew. We'll come back to John Andrew in a second. But there's another article in Time magazine. I'll put the article in the description. But he's asked about the DA and the police not being able to work together, and he called this a deadly combination. He said it's created friction. And he said he doesn't believe the district attorney would indict anyone. And this was in 2001. And he was right. He added that there have been a lot of conflicting interests. Now think about those words, a conflict of interests. And then he said what they need is somebody without an axe to grind, needs to be running things. And what was also mentioned in that article is that the DA's staff hadn't even interviewed him and his wife. Now bear in mind, Fleet and his wife were the last people to see the Ramseys. Actually, there was one other family. Just trying to think, was it the Fernies? I think the Fernies were the last to see them, but the Whites actually had the entire Ramsey family in their home for a dinner, whereas where the Ramseys went after that was just to drop something off. So they were actually, in effect, the best witnesses. So why wouldn't the DA staff go and interview them? Why wouldn't the prosecutors want to be in touch with them? And Fleet said we've got no relationship with them. He said, we want justice done for JonBenet and nobody's really working for her. And that's quite interesting. In Vanity Fair, there's some additional information that's quite interesting, written by, I think it's Anne Bardach. Excellent article. Anne Louise Bardach, published in October 1997, called JonBenet Ramsey Missing Innocence. But the part that I want to highlight is where she kind of asked Alex Hunter, are you intimidated by the law firm that John Ramsey's hired? Now, he had a lot of money that he could spend on a law firm that has been described as the most powerful in the Western United States. That's quite powerful, I'd say. Anyway, and then he said, I don't feel any intimidation, but another insider said that Hunter's twice removed from the case, meaning that he's sort of not entirely hands-on. It's kind of unfathomable to think that you have this huge case, you're the district attorney, you've got this huge case happening under your nose, but you've got somebody else handling it. Think about the district attorney in the Watts case in Greeley. Think about Michael Rourke saying to somebody else, you handle the Watts case. Well, what on earth are you going to handle then, if not that? Not a case of this size. Anyway, so Hunter then admitted to the reporter that he depends on Peter Hofstrom for his information. He's almost saying, I'm not in charge. To go and talk to Peter. Don't ask me what's going on. Go and talk to Peter. He says he's the one that's keeping me advised. So he's kind of washing his hands of this anyway, which is odd. And then he says he's what I consider to be the lead guy. Why isn't Alex Hunter the lead guy? Then in the same article, they say that was the problem, that Hofstrom ended up being an old friend of several of the Ramsey's lawyers. So you've kind of got a situation where the prosecutor in charge is literally pals with the lawyers who have the client in the middle, who's the guy in the middle, who's a powerful client as well, and that this lawyer Hofstrom socializes with Haddon's partner Brian Morgan, and then when he was confronted by police officials about possible impropriety, Hofstrom was upset. He apparently said, I'm not going to stop having my breakfast with Brian. I've known him for 20 years. So these are all things that made the JonBenet Ramsey case weird from a legal perspective, from an investigative perspective, from a kind of prosecutorial perspective. So there are two things that I just want to mention about John Andrew, since this video is kind of about him. And the one is from Detective Steve Thomas's book, JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. And I'm going to page 66 and 67. And this is just an incident where the detective had a kind of a scuffle or an encounter with the eldest son that he wasn't very happy about. So I'm just going to read it to you. And it involved a housekeeper. It involved a photographer. And this kind of thing repeated itself about 4 months later. So after the service, this is reading from Steve Thomas's book. He refers to Patsy hugging their housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh. This is the memorial service in Boulder. And Linda didn't know that Patsy had actually named her the first suspect. So Patsy's hugging her housekeeper outside the church in full view of the public, kind of saying, oh, shame, we supporting one another. Meanwhile, she'd actually named her housekeeper the first suspect. Then a scuffle broke out between the men of the church and photographers. Again, this is outside the church, as the people are emerging from the church. John Andrew Ramsey was suddenly in my face, shouting for me to get rid of them. And Steve Thomas says, I resented being treated like hired help. And when I asked a photographer to move, he taunted me for protecting a killer. I was disgusted with both of them. So you have this weird situation where the eldest son is ordering around the lead detective. The lead detective doesn't like that, but at the same time, the photographer that he's got to sort of maneuver out the way is saying, well, you're protecting a killer. I don't know whether he's referring to John Andrew, but we know that of course wasn't true. I don't know who he was referring to, but the photographer, but would be interesting to know. And then he says John Andrew then approached him, the detective, and he thought that John would say to him, please find the person who killed my child, and instead he just said thank you, and without making eye contact. And the detective then just said to him, good luck. And so the last thing that I want to just bring your attention to is an article from the 4th of April 1997, written by Michael O'Keefe, published in the Rocky Mountain News. So April 4th, 1997. And this was kind of a similar incident to what happened earlier. I don't think the Ramseys were very happy with the press. I don't think they were happy with the attention they were getting. And I think John Andrew may have heard this and also felt the same. And being 23 years old, he perhaps wanted to take matters into his own hands. And so, literally. And so, in the article, it refers to a photographer for the National Enquirer, so tabloid photographer, told police that he was assaulted at Denver International Airport. This guy's name was Alan Butterfield, 33 years old, from Salt Lake City, and he was photographing John Andrew on the concourse. And he just arrived on a flight from Atlanta, apparently. Butterfield then was a freelance photographer who said he was on assignment. And apparently what happened was, according to him, a young man swung his hand at Butterfield, knocked the camera out of his hands. The back of the camera was then knocked open and the lens was damaged. Investigators said that John Andrew is not a suspect. So that was something that was then repeated in this article as well. So it just shows you that that radio article, that Fleet White, not radio article, the radio broadcast that Fleet White was so annoyed about was still lingering in people's minds months later. And things like that, things that happen at the beginning that may not be true, can tend to remain as like a myth that, or a rumor or something, for the lifetime of an unsolved case, where people would say, well, couldn't it have been the older brother? Couldn't it have been this? Could it have been that? And I'm just saying that is how post-truth kind of asserts itself. Something that starts off as fake news and is never really properly discounted. It just becomes part of this big miasma of uncertainty. And the best way to address that is with certainty, is to find out the facts, put together a cogent narrative, knowing all the facts. In tomorrow's episode, we'll continue with the timeline. There are more events that are related to the timeline. As I just said today, 24 years ago, John Andrew left Boulder to be with his mother, Lucinda, to spend Christmas with her and also with his sister. And that was, they were going to be in Atlanta. We're not completely done with John Andrew. We still got to talk about the evidence related to John Andrew in the crime scene, the suitcase and other things, but we'll get to that in due course, especially when we're dealing with the events of the 25th of December. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.